for like 15 groups at a time. Oh, here we go. Why are we recording?
I don't know. That's weird. I did not
I'm
do
telling
that.
you, I feel like maybe it's too close to Halloween and spirits have taken over.
Yeah. Let me see if I can stop recording. Pause recording.
We always like, thank you for hitting the recording button. Hi, everyone. I'm Marcia Nedlin. I'm the organizer of the Middle Neighborhoods Community Practice. The Community Practice is sponsoring today's webinar, which we usually try to do about one every month that is on a new content topic that's relevant to our practitioners. And then we usually also offer a Middle Neighborhoods 101 webinar at some point in the month as well. So today is a webinar I've had a long time coming. Actually, go back a minute. And because this is a classic Marcia Nedlin title for a webinar, people know that I make them very long. I think it's something I learned about. If people can't read what you're talking about in the title, they'll never read the description. So, you know, that's a matter of debate. But today is a practical method for assessing the physical conditions, not of a few properties in your neighborhood, but of every property in your middle neighborhood, and the exciting ways that you can put that data into action. I have watched our speakers today do that over and over again, and it has transformed the way I think about what's possible in terms of understanding what's going on in a neighborhood as you develop strategy for how to strengthen and revitalize that neighborhood. And it's been quite a while that I've wanted them to share their secrets, and it's extremely generous of them to do that today. So that's what we're going to hear today. So go ahead, Anne. The Middle Neighborhoods, National Middle Neighborhoods Initiative is young. It's only about 5 years old. And it sort of has two big parts to it right now. The first is a national steering committee of about 20 researchers, practitioners, and policymakers who deal with things like policy research, the communication strategy and advocacy, and that is managed by the National Community Stabilization Trust, NCST. And the other part is managed in partnership with NeighborWorks America, and that's the community practice, which is sponsoring this now. You can go ahead and advance that slide. So this is, our numbers keep changing. It's an informal, facilitated, lightly facilitated network. We're trying to get a handle on our numbers now. It's somewhere between 300 and 800 people, I think. The last I heard, I thought it was 800. In any case, there are a lot of us across the country. We're growing all the time. We absolutely encourage you to join us no matter what your role is in neighborhoods. You can do that at the bottom of any page on our website at middleneighborhoods.org. And what we do is we try to create ways for practitioners and others across the country to connect with each other, to share best practices, to do things like join each other's research projects, all kinds of stuff. We can organize a virtual site visit. We can deliver Middle Neighborhoods webinar to any kind of group that you organize in your own community. So we're really here to support you in that work. So I like to hit the highlights of the characteristics of middle neighborhoods, just for those of you who may not have attended a 101, Middle Neighborhoods 101 webinar in the past. Today's webinar actually applies to any kind of neighborhood. It's not limited at all to middle neighborhoods. However, since we're the ones hosting, the characteristics of middles, these are general characteristics. There are exceptions, of course. They tended to have been built mostly as single family housing and built for families with children, which is one of their vulnerabilities because that is a declining demographic these days. They tend to still have well more than 50% owner occupancy. Although if you look at the long-term trends, that's slowly eroding. The housing stock is aging, but in good condition. The issues we often see is that it's not competing well for today's home buyers because it doesn't have enough bedrooms or bathrooms. It's usually bathrooms. You know, there's some aspects of it that are not competing well with the new construction today. Property values are more often than not a concern because they're declining or they're failing to keep pace with citywide increases in property values or inflation, which is necessary for the long-term health of cities. Most of our members as I said, don't see hyperinflation of housing prices a risk. Of course, everyone has had a different experience with that over the last 18 months with the COVID epidemic and the differences in prices. And boy, do I ever look forward to a day when we can sort of do a post-mortem on the COVID epidemic and its impact on housing markets, but it seems like we're still kind of in the thick of it. We do have cases, especially as our membership starts to grow out west and in the Southwest and South, places that are higher growth areas that do authentically see gentrification, in which case those are their strategies. One of the most interesting things I think about middle neighborhoods is that they tend to be more racially, ethnically, and economically diverse than either their lower income or higher income counterparts. And they are also, importantly, a place where a lot of, working and middle-class families hold their household wealth, and it's where they accumulate wealth and from which they pass it on. So the reason we're concerned, next slide, is just that these neighborhoods we've observed are starting to falter in their sustainability. And to me, lately, my definition of sustainability is just that, they're no longer on autopilot in terms of their ability to attract replacement owner occupant buyers or the best of the investors in generating home values that would actually support quality maintenance, repairs, and updates without running into big appraisal gaps. They're starting to not be able to repel irresponsible investors in many cases. If prices dip low enough, it becomes real catnip for the worst of investors. As transitions happen with neighbors moving out, then your engaged resident community, which is really the lifeblood of any neighborhood, starts to take hits on leadership. And finally, just the ongoing ability of neighborhoods to deliver home equity to owners and revenue to municipal governments. These are all the things that we are starting to see, to one degree or another, start to erode in middle neighborhoods across America. And the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative is really focused on raising attention around these issues and hopefully helping practitioners, whether it's city government, nonprofits, or others, to intervene now before these become our next set of very distressed neighborhoods and become much more expensive to address. Okay, so now, one more thing. We do have a mapping tool if you want to just dip in a little bit and see where the middle neighborhoods might be in your community. This is organized by MSA. There are a lot of different ways you can look at it in terms of, I think this is household income. And you can look as low as 60 to 100% of area median for a city at the city level, all the way up to the higher range would be 80 to 120 at a national level. And you can tinker around with that and see what pops up in your neighborhoods. Okay, now our guests today are long-term colleagues of mine. I've had the great pleasure of being able to work with them now and then on projects that they do, which is how I became familiar with this technique that they use. So Charles Bucke is the founder and president of CZB LLC, a small planning firm that up until very recently was located in Alexandria, Virginia, and is moving to Maine, at least for its summer headquarters. Pete Lombardi is director of revitalization planning there, and Pete works out of Buffalo, New York. So they also have staff members in Denver, and I should know this. Where else, Charles? Oh, he's probably on mute.
That's a good question.
They have a few.
I think
Go ahead.
Denver, Park City, Utah.
Park City.
Oh, Park City, of course, Utah.
Buffalo. So yeah.
I'll warn everybody out there, if you haven't already worked with Charles, he has a habit of poaching his staff from his client bases. So I'm trying to think of one of his staff persons who wasn't formerly a client, but beware when you hire him. So both of them are they're very unique in their approach to, I think, into analyzing the dynamics of what's going on in neighborhood markets, both just at the neighborhood level and at the citywide level and regional level. They are very, I would say, market sensitive in their assessment of what's going on. They pay a lot of attention to supply and demand. And so their tools are often developed in a way to help them understand what's going on with supply and demand so that they can develop strategies with their clients that are working in concert with those choices and are informed by those choices. So I'm going to stop talking now. Just to let everyone know, we're going to turn over the agenda to Charles and Pete for a while, and we'll save all the questions till the end, although you may type them into the chat along the way if you like. So thanks so much, Charles and Pete. It's such a delight to have you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Marcia. Is the audio okay? Is this about right, volume-wise? Okay,
I
great.
think so.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm Charles Bucchi, and we appreciate, Pete and I both appreciate being invited to share a little bit of what we've been working on over the years. I do want to thank Marcia and Ann for helping us put this together. And I want to acknowledge the really good work that Middle Neighborhoods does, and just to underscore how important their work is and how valued it is. And throughout some of the slides, at least, there's a theme, which is, just in many respects, what Pete and I have done and are doing with our own colleagues is, it rests on the shoulders of a lot of work done by others that preceded us, both academic and in the field, and sometimes both. We're pretty shameless in taking good ideas and trying to incorporate them best we can and build on them. And hopefully, we can give you something that will be useful for you all. So we have a few dozen slides. Marcia or Ann, could you advance that for us? I'll go through a handful up front, how our firm came to think about scoring and resource scarcity and middle neighborhoods and how these are connected. From time to time, I'll flag or underscore and what I think is an important word or word combination that just gets knitted together that you may wish to think about. So the first is resource scarcity. It's an ever-present reality in our work and underscores the importance of this piece of data, how we collect it, how we think about it. So I'll cover a handful of slides and turn it over to Pete to walk you through the mechanics. That's generally how we do things. I stay at a high altitude. I don't really know much. I turn it over to Pete, and Pete gets us into the end zone. So that's how most of our projects work these days. Next slide. I started the firm back in 2001, and for the first several years, it was basically me and my 20-year partner, Karen Pooley. She had just finished her PhD at Penn, and we started working together and thinking really about how to answer this question. What's the difference between, all the information you want to have and what's really actionable? And that sort of pushed the two of us to, discard lots of data that we found interesting, but ultimately, wouldn't be a difference maker, and focus and drill down on what was most important. She and I and my dear friend David Belke, we did maybe 100 or so projects together before David retired. But of course, he's retired 14, 15, 16 times. So, for those of you who've worked with David, you'll understand. A lot of our work is influenced not just by David, but by my old dear friend Mike Schubert and Marcia and others. From an academic standpoint, if there are any of you out there who are inclined that way, much of the work that we think about, it's influenced by Rolf Getz, Dal Myers, Bob Putnam, William Julius Wilson, George Mack, George Galster, and Susan Wachter. Those are really the primary influences just in terms of helping us think through things. I'm sure you're familiar with most of their work, and if not, I would encourage you to do that. Next slide. So we're presently working in a number of communities. This is, a near or recent past. It's not an exhaustive list, but it gives you a sense of the different kinds of places we're working in. I did a 3-city swing last week, kind of through COVID Central. It was Greenville, South Carolina, then Chattanooga, then Memphis. So I'm just, hoping that that I haven't transmitted anything or caught anything. Can you go to the next slide, Marcia? The ones that we've got highlighted here are ones that we have done, scoring. So you can see that we're not using it everywhere. We are using it in quite a few places, but I think personally, and I think Pete and Marcia would underscore this, it's scoring is invaluable, and time and budget permitting, I would do it everywhere. It really does boil down to a combination of factors, but it is an invaluable piece of this picture. I think Pete would agree. The tiniest places we've scored have been, like there's a little tiny dairy community in the middle of nowhere in the southern tier of New York. It takes like 6 hours to get to from anywhere. It's a little Perry, New York. It's beautiful, little place of 3,500. Across the line into northwest Erie County is little Corey, Pennsylvania, just 6,000. Little Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh, so 10,000. So just lots of places, little places. But we've done some larger places too, end to end. Buffalo at, I guess, 250, 260. Now twice actually. So I don't know, Pete could correct me, but maybe 71 or 72,000 structures. Twice. So that's Des Moines at 215,000 folks, Chattanooga with all of its hills. And we can talk about topography and whatnot and the practical challenges of scoring in July in Memphis, in Chattanooga, but each place's size, population, area, topography, climate, it influences practicality. And this morning I was just sort of doing some mental housekeeping. I think we've done about not quite 600,000 structures now. So it's a big database. And you learn to look for things, think about things. Cities I've forgotten we had even been to, we've scored. I started to really make a list this morning. Next slide. I'm sorry, next one again, Marcia. Actually, back up, Marcia, I'm sorry. So one thing I would say is scoring was born out of necessity, number one. Number two, any place can be scored. You will find that there's always a middle because there's always a head and a tail of every distribution. Okay, so those become important in how you use the data and think about in our experience. When we say middle, and we appreciate that, if you ask 10 folks, you might get 10 definitions of middle, but for us, we stumbled upon this and it was of necessity. It was of, and I'll come back to that sort of stringing these Christmas lights together, this notion of resource scarcity. It was of necessity that we came to it, which is for us, and this, I know middle neighborhoods, you've got your own definition right now, but for us, it's a bit more loosey-goosey, and it can be refined and tailored, but it is those places that are simultaneously and empirically at risk of decline, yet affordably recoverable, right? And so you can narrow it and tailor it, but that helps us. It helps us help clients to think that way. Okay, so next slide. Thanks, Ann. So back in 2003, we had 2 clients. These were our early scoring cities, in Ohio, Bowling Green and Canton, in New York, Jamestown and Oswego. Jamestown was the first place we did end to end to end. But there were 2 clients back around 2003 or thereabouts. It was Ogden, Utah, and Atlanta, or 2 cities. In Ogden, it was the client was the city. In Atlanta, it was the Annie E. Casey Foundation. This is germane because on its face, it makes sense that the city of Ogden might not have all the money it wished it had to address all of the neighborhood challenges it thought it had. And then when you have a client like the Annie Casey Foundation, you have a client who has more money than God, and you think, my goodness, we have all the money you could possibly ever want. And that is until you actually start thinking about solving problems and you realize even they don't have all the money that is required. And so resource scarcity became for us a driving voice in our heads about how to think about helping the client. We got to Ogden, Utah. There was a neighborhood outside of downtown. The goal was help us revitalize this neighborhood. Of course, as soon as David and I got to Ogden, we realized, well, it's not a neighborhood, it's like 5 neighborhoods, and it's not 5 blocks, it's 71 blocks stretching 2.5 miles. And the city just, it had only a little bit of resources. So we had to figure out where to start. And we had no system to speak of. So what we did was we organized the blocks and ranked them essentially, 1, 2, 3. And we kept it at the block level. And what we did was we scored them by how we, based on sales data and conversations with realtors and lenders and residents, not from the area, but who knew the neighborhood, how they would be reading that neighborhood, reading those blocks. We scored it 1, 2, 3. And at about the same time, David and I were doing 5 neighborhoods outside of the Olympic Village in Atlanta. And it was a large geography with a lot of stocks. And we had to figure out a way to organize our thinking. And so we divided up the blocks. And we would each take, we committed to do, each of us would score 800 a day. We divided and conquered, and we walked for days until, with our yellow legal pads, we scored several thousand properties, 1, 2, 3. Except there we did it on the basis of what we thought was the pride exhibited on the exterior of the house. And those were sort of 2 building blocks for that eventually became how we would think about scoring, that we then took to Jamestown and went end to end to end, and then various cities after, one after another. Next slide. And that helped us also, as we would do parts of cities, Baltimore and Pittsburgh and whatnot. And in any case, by marrying David's work in Michigan, a lot of Alan Malik's thinking, Mike Schubert's eternal question, which was who's moving in and who's moving out and why, Marcia Nedlin insisting that we figure out, who are you going to try to sell this house to? Who's the next buyer going to become? Scoring became a pretty invaluable tool for us for strategy, and it especially so with scarce resources. And what we eventually, were able to do was align our scoring with the exterior image of the property that allowed us to zoom in or zoom out at a variety of scales with this notion always on the back of our minds that each home is a billboard for the image of the neighborhood. Okay. So next slide. What it did was it allowed us to think very coherently just about, risk and return in the eyes of the market. Okay. And begin, subjective though the scoring is, to think objectively and aggregate the data, and then to begin to, assemble different data sets and connect the dots in creative ways. So I don't know that this is Oswego, New York, but I think it is Oswego, New York, and it's near SUNY, New York, and it's between SUNY, New York and downtown, which is a sort of a strip that was overwhelmed by bad student rentals and overall economic decline. And I show this slide because it kind of captures how dramatic an impact, the resident and owner are of otherwise very similar stocks. It's a good teaching tool too. And it allows you to walk with residents, walk with neighbors and say, well, what do you think about this house? And I should underscore this too, and we'll come back to it. The scoring in many cases, it is the point, but it's also not the point. It becomes a tool that can be used in as many ways as you are creative. So Pete will talk about that, but it's the conversations that come from scoring, the on the ground, tactile work of it actually becomes very, very helpful late when you're doing strategy development. Next slide. Over time, several of us worked, years ago to refine a way to understand and explain how neighborhoods work. And I'm sure this is very familiar to you all, but this notion of how markets connect to capacity, to conditions, and to image. And from our point of view, if you focus on the bottom right, the conditions right there, what is the condition of the structure? You can work backwards and very quickly deduce, what's the capacity of the owner / resident, and work forwards and say, what's the resulting image? And now you've got a way to think about how do I influence the trajectory of this house, this block, this side of the street, What's my whole block strategy? How do these pieces fit together? And then I'll go to the last slide for me before I turn it over to the meats of everything. Thanks, Ann. Is our scoring system itself. So we've monkeyed around with 3-point systems, 5-point systems, 6-point systems, systems that have a plus and a minus, systems that have, trending this way, trending that way, any kind, we've tried all kinds of systems. What we like about the 5-point system is that you can understand it, you can map it, you can teach it, you can score it, you can analyze it. It's very conducive to resident leadership development, and it leaves no one out of the conversation. Everybody can be involved. And so at the top, far left is our 1. It's in excellent condition. It's for that market. Okay, it's in excellent condition. We tend to think of a 2 as, it could become a 1 in 2 months of Saturdays of sweat equity. A 3 is right in the middle of that particular market. We pay no attention to the grandness of the house. This is all about, does the resident take pride in the house and take care of the house? And you can deduce from that, once you're experienced, am I looking at a house with a shut-in, an elderly widow, a cat lady, all the, you can work backwards very quickly and know exactly what you're looking at. By the time you get to a 4, you're in negative equity territory anywhere, unless you find like an East Palo Alto ranch house. It's always going to be negative equity territory. And then a 5 is what a 5 is. It's abject distress, and short of it being historic, it's time to just get rid of it. Because if it's not historic and it's in that condition, and it's staying in that condition, your land is worth 0. And it's a pointless recovery effort. But we can talk about those details later. That's kind of my general setup. I hope that's okay, Marcia. And Pete, you want to take it away?
Yes, thanks, Charles, and thanks, Marcia and Ann. And I'll note right off the bat that there's construction going on in my neighborhood this afternoon. So I apologize for any background noise that you might hear. So Charles talked about kind of the origins of the field survey. I'll spend a few minutes talking about how it's been used on recent projects before getting into more detail about the mechanics of the field survey. So we'll start by focusing on how it gets used, because as Charles said, it's the point, but it's not the point. It's how that becomes actionable, strategically useful data. Next slide. And we'll start by showing 2 maps from a project recently in Des Moines, Iowa. So the map on the left here is a parcel level map of those 5 scoring points that Charles just discussed, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where 5 are the very severely distressed properties. The greens are the excellent or good properties. And the property on the right, or the map on the right, shows an averaging of those scores at the block group level. So there are a number of different ways that we can represent the data once it's been collected. In the case of Des Moines here, we were hired initially to evaluate their neighborhood revitalization strategies and systems. And we started off by asking the question, well, what condition are your neighborhoods in today? What's going on? Where are you trying to go with them? And what's the distance, if any, between your current revitalization systems and the systems that you need, the tools that you need to get what you want to achieve? So understanding what was going on in the neighborhoods was really important to determine what exactly a future neighborhood revitalization system needed to look like for Des Moines. Next slide. And we identified, working with the city of Des Moines and its stakeholders, exactly what they wanted to achieve. And we identified several middle neighborhoods that were strategically important to the city of Des Moines. And this map here is from a subsequent project that we did with Des Moines, partnered with Marsh & Nedlund to create 4 neighborhood plans for 4 targeted middle neighborhoods that were selected by the city. These were a few of these were kind of upper middle neighborhoods, a few of them were lower middle neighborhoods, but the city recognized that these were extremely important strategically to make sure that they didn't keep slipping. Excuse me, and that they would serve as really pilot cases of really rigorous middle neighborhood revitalization work for the city of Des Moines. So these 4 neighborhood revitalization plans came together for each of the 4 neighborhoods you see here. The verbiage here was developed by Marcia, creating what essentially were vision statements for each of these 4 neighborhoods. And the city of Des Moines subsequently created a new not-for-profit called Invest DSM. If you have a chance, look it up, Invest DSM, which is now a not-for-profit that is using these 4 neighborhood revitalization plans for these 4 neighborhoods to implement the strategies from those plans. They're doing a lot of really creative work in terms of assisting property owners make really, in many cases, above market upgrades to their properties, because many of the observations that we were making during this work was that a lot of properties in these neighborhoods, as Marcia mentioned, they might not have enough bathrooms, they might be a little bit smaller than the market is looking for these days. And so Invest DSM really was created to help residents make these above market upgrades to homes that wouldn't have made sense a few years ago. But now there's an entity in place that really is a powerful intervention tool in these 4 middle neighborhoods. Next slide. Here's another project, as Charles mentioned, Buffalo, New York, where I live and work from, is our largest community that we've surveyed, over 70,000 residential properties. The map on the left is another parcel level map that shows how every single parcel in the city scored. We used the field survey as well as a number of other local data sets and census data sets to create the map on the right here. The map on the right is a housing market demand typology for Buffalo. As you can see, deep blue, highest demand areas, the maroon are lowest demand areas in the city of Buffalo. And the field survey was just one component, but an important component in identifying how demand varies in different neighborhoods around the city. Next slide. And one of the outcomes of that market typology was an identification within each market type in the city of Buffalo of what were the outcomes that the city is striving for, recognizing that you're going to have realistically different outcomes that you're aiming for in your highest demand areas, in your moderate demand areas, and in areas with lower demand. So being clear about what are the realistic outcomes for each of those types of markets, and what are the strategies that would be needed to achieve those outcomes. Next slide. Baltimore, next here, we see on this map of this fairly small neighborhood in East Baltimore, where we use the field survey method to score row houses in this part of Baltimore. Same 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scoring system here. Next slide. And just as in the case in Buffalo, where the field survey was used to create a market typology, in the case of Baltimore here, the field survey and several other data sets were used to create block level typologies or strategic typologies. As you can see here, development blocks, legacy blocks, transition blocks, and opportunity blocks, each one representing a different set of outcomes that community is looking to achieve, and a different set of strategies and tools that are appropriate to achieve what's realistic given the conditions on these different blocks. Next slide. The final example here of using the field survey in order to develop a strategy that's useful to our client is Oswego, New York. This is a map of Oswego on the shores of Lake Ontario in upstate New York, a city of about 12 to 15,000. I believe in Oswego, it was a 1 to 6 point scale that was used, a little bit different than typical, but same basic idea here. You see the red on this map are the most distressed properties. The green are the properties that are in the best condition. Next slide. And in Oswego's case, the field survey and a wide range of other data and qualitative observations were used to identify middle market sub-areas within Oswego that would be useful for a consortium involving the college there, philanthropy, the business sector, and the city to work together to make sure that vulnerable middle neighborhoods in that city were strategically handled in a way that they hadn't been before. In many cases, these are neighborhoods that might not have been targets for CDBG resources and other typical neighborhood funding sources that small entitlement cities use. So this was used to identify some middle market sub areas. 5 initially, it got winnowed down to 4. And now Oswego has been working with these maps and has been working with a neighborhood revitalization strategy since, I believe, 2013 or 2014 to shore up these middle neighborhood areas. If you visit Oswego Renaissance Association online, you'll see all of the great work that they're doing there to work with neighbors to really stimulate high levels of reinvestment in these middle neighborhoods. Next slide. So those are some examples of how the field survey has been converted into actionable information on a couple of different projects. I'll talk next about how the field survey is actually done. And right before we delve into these slides, I'll mention that, as Charles noted, we work with different surveyors in each community from a range of different backgrounds. Often they're students. Often we'll hire and train college students if there's a local college. In some cases, we work with just local residents. A volunteer steering committee might be at the core of a project, and we'll work with those resident volunteers to go block to block scoring their neighborhood. So we work with resident volunteers, college students, in some cases, city staff or nonprofit staff have been involved in compiling this information. So it really is something that you work with the human resources that are available. And in many cases, working with resident volunteers and local staff help those individuals see their neighborhoods, see their community in a slightly different way than they typically look at it when they're actually going from house to house to house, partnered with a colleague or a neighbor, looking at things, talking about things. It's a really useful way to build knowledge and build self-understanding within a community. Charles mentioned yellow legal pads. We were actually doing this using pen and paper up until just a few years ago, where we would train surveyors to scroll down the address, give it a score, work on to the next house, and ultimately get back to their computer and fill out a spreadsheet that would have a parcel number attached to each address. So that what sounds now like a very cumbersome manual process we used up until just a few years ago. We've since switched over to a system called Regrid, formerly called LandGrid. There are a number of different mapping apps that do something similar, but we now use a handheld app that actually makes it much easier to train folks and to record things and analyze the results much sooner. So that's just a little bit background on the technology and how that's evolved and who we do the scoring with. Someone's asking about the name of the app. The one that we're using is Regrid. You go to regrid.com. Next slide, please. So talk a little bit about how this scoring is actually done. Charles already gave an overview of the 5-point system that we typically use. Next slide. And just to go in a little more detail, as Charles mentioned, the 1 and 2 scores that we use, at the very top, an excellent condition property is one that has multiple green flags, what we call green flags, and I'll describe those a little bit more on the next slide. But basically, a house that's rated a 1 is a property that really there aren't any real ways that you can ding the property in terms of lack of attention to detail or something being deferred, some sort of maintenance being deferred on the property. A 1 is a property that really hits all the marks, excellent condition, and also exhibits pride of ownership in a noticeable way. Those are excellent properties that receive a score of 1. Properties that are scored a 2, there's nothing wrong with them. They're in great condition. There might just be a few small matters missing in terms of attention to detail on 1 or 2 components of the property, but there isn't any visible deferred maintenance. It's in good shape. It just doesn't rise to that level of pride and excellence that a property with a 1 would receive. Skipping over 3 for a moment, if we look at 4 and 5, on 4 and 5, we look for what we call red flags. Whether that's peeling paint, a porch that's looking a little bit tilty, landscaping that clearly isn't being taken care of. We train our surveyors to note things that express a lack of attention to detail and actual neglect. That neglect is being beset in. So a score of 4 reflects moderate distress. This looks like a property that's begun to slip, is beginning to weaken in condition, and a property that receives a score of 5 has multiple so-called red flags. And it's clear that neglect has been taking hold of that property for some time. Charles?
Yeah, just a point here, and that if you're training folks, you have to be determined to make them score hard. Okay, you are going to find scorers who are just incredibly and overly sympathetic, right? Well, that's Dolores, and I know Dolores, and she's a nice person, right? And then suddenly Dolores is a 2 instead of a 4, right? Or my grandmother has a house just like this, and they can't imagine scoring that house a 4, but it is a 4, right? And you have to spot check scores. You have to go back. You have to double check, and you have to do it early in a scoring process, right? And so just know. So, for instance, if you get a handful of undergraduates, right, besides the challenge of herding cats, which is not small, there will be sympathies in your scores, and you cannot allow that. You got to make them evaluate it the way the market would evaluate it. Okay. And that means some discipline. So while it is subjective, it becomes a less valuable tool the softer the score.
Charles, could you just say another sentence or two on why it's important that these are scored with the idea that that's the way the market sees it?
Because the market doesn't know that Dolores lives in there. It doesn't care. The market's going to make a snap decision. Okay. It's going to decide, do I want to proceed down this street or not? Do I want to put my life savings as the down payment on this street or not? It's going to make that decision in about 30 seconds, right? And it is going to do so indiscriminately, right? Just very quickly. So, what you want to do is try to mimic that. So I'm going through, what's going on here, right? Now, you certainly want to take the time, if you have it in your budget and your time, to then back up and make notes that say, okay, I'm pretty sure this is a real potential champion on this block, right? This person is clearly out there doing all they can, right? You're always going to find the 66-year-old person who's out there with little tweezers trimming their sidewalk, okay? And so those stories will matter later when you develop strategy. But for the purpose of scoring, it's quick and it's ruthless.
Yeah, and I think it's really probably one of the important training components is these scores are not a judgment on the people who live in the property in any way. It is an assessment.
It is an absolute judgment of the property.
Right.
It is no judgment whatsoever on, because you don't know. you're doing 800 a day. You're flying through this, right? So that's what the market's doing.
That's right. And, you know, in terms of the properties that are scored a 3, the market looks at a 3 as kind of an ambiguous case. It's a property that if you look at it, there isn't pride coming off of that property. You don't really see active maintenance and pride of ownership, but you also don't yet see, you know, very visible signs of deferred maintenance. So a 3 is a property that is kind of in between. No active investment is obvious. No active neglect is obvious. It's sort of in the middle. And usually the way to think about a 3 is if it's unclear to you where that property is in 5 years, is that a property that could improve? Could it decline? You don't really know. That's a property that gets scored a 3. The challenge with training is that a 3 can often be a default place for a surveyor to score a property if they're just kind of not too sure. And so what we want to do is usually make sure that before you score something a 3, think about it again. Because a three is a useful score for us, but not useful if someone just sort of falls into the routine of not wanting to make a judgment and saying that it's a 3. So a 3 is the trickiest territory for a surveyor, and it's also potentially poses the biggest risks to having actionable, useful data to score at the end of the process. Next slide. And so I mentioned red flags and green flags as things that we ask surveyors to look for. So green flags, if you see numerous signs that the porch is a very appealing, well-kept porch, roof and gutters are in good condition of the siding, condition of the landscaping, seasonal decorations are something that can express pride of ownership, attention to detail, that are, they say something about the property and the things that are noticed by the wider market. All of those are green flags, and all of those can be interpreted as signs of active ownership, and those can feed into designating a property of 1 or 2. The red flags basically are the green flags, but in reverse. The paint is peeling, landscaping is neglected, the roof is clearly showing some age. All of those are signs of inactive ownership. As Marcia said, we don't really care why it's a sign of inactive ownership. Is it because the owner doesn't have the financial or physical ability to make the improvements? Is it a slum landlord who lives 2 states away, who is actively withdrawing investment from the property? The other data that we look at later on can help to tease out those subtleties, which are strategically important in terms of coming up with the right toolbox to help a neighborhood. But for the purposes of this survey, we don't care what the story is behind the inactive ownership. But again, that's part of the broader picture that we look at using other data sets later on. Next slide, please. So we'll just finish up the overview of the survey just by looking at a few houses to talk about, again, how we train our surveyors. These pictures are from Oswego, New York, just like that picture earlier on that Charles showed is from Oswego. So this is a property that if you're looking for green flags and red flags, this is a good example of a property that has multiple green flags that stand out right away. It's the hydrangea, it's the hanging baskets, you have freshly painted steps. You have a number of different signals that are coming from this property that someone is actively maintaining what appears to be a duplex to a really high standard. And I believe this property was scored a 1 for its neighborhood in Geneva because it clearly shows pride of ownership. It's top of the market in its neighborhood. Next slide. Here's another example of a property that received a score of a 1 in Oswego. Architecturally an interesting building, certainly, but the various core components of the property are well maintained. The landscaping here is sort of identified as really what elevates it probably from a 2 to a 1. just the level of investment and effort that went into creating a fairly recently improved landscaping in front of the house, expresses pride and confidence in a way that is noticeable to neighbors, noticeable to the wider market. Next slide. Another example of a one from Oswego. Again, we sort of rattled off a list of things that stand out as points of pride and active maintenance and ownership of this property. You might not be a fan of vinyl siding, but everything about this property expresses a high level of pride that, again, is sort of sets a high standard for this neighborhood. Next slide. Here's a property that I received. I think it received a score of 2 in Oswego. It's in good repair. It's a solid property. There are no signs of deferred maintenance. A property like this just doesn't rise to the level of a 1. Probably because you have some relatively sparse-looking landscaping in front of it. It doesn't all come together the way that a property in excellent condition does, but it's certainly a good, healthy property. Next slide. Here's another property that received a 2 in Oswego. Again, nothing visibly wrong with this property. It's a healthy looking property. It just doesn't rise to the level of 1. It doesn't really turn your head in the way that a property that receives an excellent score does, but another good example of a 2. Next slide.
Hey, Pete, can I quick say something?
Sure.
Somebody asked a question about whether the scores are public. So one of the first things I do is I look up the addresses for everybody on city council, mayor, planning commission, boards, and we don't get those houses wrong. And so there's going to be some error factor, no matter how good and determined you are. The error should be small, but you don't want to get those wrong because it's just, well, it's self-explanatory. So just do that. Get those right.
But you also, I've observed that you guys more often than not present publicly. If you're presenting any of the data, it's on averages of blocks rather than individual properties. Is that true, or am I exaggerating that?
It's true, but people will ask from time to time, and there's always a nice moment of levity with council where someone will say, "Oh my God, I hope they didn't score my house till next Saturday," or
so you have time to fix it or whatever.
Yeah, and it's a gentle reminder that the market pays attention, and it's actually a great teaching tool for councils to start thinking about that. Anyway,
I also observed once, I was in a meeting with Pete where he was presenting to sort of a steering committee for a particular neighborhood, the scores on an individual property basis for their neighborhood. And there was one of the leaders in the group was someone who I think had just sold their home. And she actually engaged us in a conversation about how she thought her property was a higher score than it was. And one of the fascinating things to me that I think is important for everyone on this call to know is that they had already associated all of the scores with their sales prices from MLS data. And Pete could show a chart that basically showed the average sales price for all the different score groups in that neighborhood. And in fact, her property had sold for exactly the average sales price for her score group. And so it was, there's a number of different ways I think that this data becomes credible because of other data associated with it.
No, that's a very good point. And yeah, that's a good example of how we, again, the field survey is not a standalone data set that is used just by itself. It's about melding it with all of these other sources and qualitative observations to really make it useful and create a strategy that means something. Charles?
Let me amplify. Someone asked a question here which it's hard for you to see while you're speaking, but I can see. It's the difference between a 2 and a 1 score feels very subjective. How do you limit this when it comes to the small details? Okay, so it's a great question. Let's subtract the softest markets in the United States from the conversation for a second. Johnstown, Pennsylvania. All right, let's take that out just for a second. Okay, And let's subtract the very, very strong markets, okay, where land actually is scarce and it's a driving component, okay? A 1 in a reasonably performing sales market, okay, will sell quickly at or near full price. So time on market and the difference between list and sale will be fairly quickly, okay? A 2 will lag on the market a little bit if it's not brought up into a 1 by the time it gets listed and is shown. And we tend to think that the difference in my mind is about 2 months of Saturdays of sweat equity on the part of the owner of a 2, with landscaping, some scraping and painting, some lighting, some treatments to the exterior can often, the things that a realtor would help somebody do. A smart realtor would say, listen, Leroy, I know you want to sell your house. Listen, Pete, I know you want to sell your house. However, okay, you're not going to get the price you want until you do a few things. And I know you think it looks great, but it looks good. It doesn't look great. And so, if you want to list on October 1, you need to start getting busy on August 1, and those weekends can move it from a 2 to a 1. That's how we tend to look at it.
And this slide is actually a good example. If you take away that little seasonal banner and the 2 urns with mums in front of this house, it's a different story. And it reads as a different situation to a person going down this street. This is a property that you could argue it's a 1, you could argue it's a 2. There's a fine line for a property like this. But if you take away kind of those 2 green flags, one of which is literally a flag, the perception of this property changes. And it is, in this case, it wasn't 2 weekends of Saturdays. It was, $20, at Home Depot and an hour, basically, that changes the face of a property like this.
Great point, Pete. I'm following some of these questions too, just back and forth. There's a question on matching sales price with scores. We look for the correlations, okay, and the correlations are very, 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 very powerful, and then they allow us to work from those correlations and begin to understand, what a strategy might look like. There's a follow-up question, a great question. It's a question that actually shows a lot of insight from Josh Campbell. Do kids, toys, play sets, et cetera, found within the yard play a role? Without question, okay? So, we're looking for things like the truck parked on the front yard. We're looking for things, like the hose that hasn't been rolled up in weeks. So the toys are fine, but we want the toys, put away at the end of the day, and so you are definitely looking for whether or not the resident, okay, is minding the property, okay? And so if it looks chaotic, it is chaotic. And if it's chaotic, it's an issue. And so depending on essentially the stewardship of stuff, right? Whether it's lawn furniture, garden tools, children's toys, what have you, those are all things you want to be thinking about.
Next slide. I think the last few pictures here just kind of show, we've been looking at 1s and 2s. Now, a property like this, you could argue is it could be a 3. You might argue it's a 4. You have obviously some problem with neglected landscaping. You have patchy repairs to a roof. So there are a couple of red flags that you can identify in this property that might put this in a 4 territory, or kind of a lower 3. As Charles said, we sometimes use pluses and minuses with our survey. If there's a direction that is discernible to the surveyor, that a property seems to be trending in one way or another, that can help give us a sense of what is the gut sense of the surveyor when they look at something like this. Taking it in all together, does this look like a property that's sort of really right in the middle and staying put in the middle, or does it seem like it's trending downward? But again, this is a case that it gets a little bit difficult, and you really have to be careful and sit back and think: do I see green flags? Do I see red flags? What does my gut tell me if I looking at this through the eyes of the market? Next slide.
Pete,
Go ahead.
let me take this quick question from Amy
Sure.
Mesner, who writes, I get this approach and have been using this logic in my work for 15 years, but I'm curious as to how you have handled questions from towns or other clients about the potential for the approach to be seen as redlining, and how have you gotten past those concerns? It's a great question, right? So as Marcia said earlier, there's no evaluation of who's in the house. The focus is, what does the house read like? And the purpose, from our point of view in our work, the purpose is to figure out, if I have 20 houses that where demolition would be suitable, and I only have enough money to remove 2. If I have 20 houses that would be suitable for upgrades, and I only have the money for 2, right? Or any various combination of how you live in the reality of resource scarcity, right? The reason we score is to give us one more piece of data to begin figuring out, to some extent on a utilitarian basis, where does the money that you have, which is never all you want, make most sense to deploy, right? And so what we find is that conversation with the client, when we ask those questions, helps that client sort through their own priorities, right? And then they can determine where they want to spend their money, right? So they may say, I want to take these 2 demolitions out. And we'll say, okay, are you sure? And then you get a good conversation about the impact of removing 2 abjectly distressed properties and leaving another 18 untouched, right? And it's what you're really trying to do is help your client think through the various goals they have and prioritize. And so the scoring system helps give real depth to those conversations. Pete?
Oh, thanks, Charles. I think the last few slides here again are kind of properties that are that's scored lower. In this case, this is a good example that people will see a house that there might be construction going on. How do I score a house that it looks like is under renovation? I think in a case like this was scored a 3 with a plus notation, because there was enough fresh wood, like on the steps there, to suggest that this is a property that's probably on the upswing. There's work being done to it. So this, on the day that it's being scored, it's in the middle, but there's also enough evidence that it's heading in the right direction. And that can be verified later on if you look at building permit databases, for example, what's happening with that property on that block. Next slide. The next, I think, 3 pictures or so are of 4s and 5s. So on this property here, fading siding, paint peeling. This is a 4. Next slide. A roof that's a little bit saggy, an old awning, no landscaping to speak of, some peeling paint on the garage in the background. Another case of a 4, enough red flags there to clear that it's clear this is a property that's sliding down, it's in moderate distress. Next slide. Anything that's boarded up, regardless of why, it could be that there was a fire last week, it could be that it's been abandoned for 5 years. This is sending out all sorts of bad signals to the market just by merit of having those windows missing and boarded up. Next slide. I think this is our last picture. This was a house that was scored, I believe, a 5 in Oswego, between snow not being shoveled, not being removed, a porch that's coming off the house, siding damage, gutter damage. They're just sort of overwhelming red flags on a property like this that merited a 5 score for this property. Next slide. And so that's a really quick primer on kind of how we look at these properties and how we train the surveyors to look at these properties. I know we've already been going through some questions that have been coming up along the way, but we'll stop now and hand it back to you, Marcia, and we can get
Thanks.
deeper into any questions.
Hey, Pete, while Marcia's asking a question, can you pull up the Erie comp plan and pull up the east side of, do you have any, where we can take a look at one of those blocks where we show each of the scores? Do you remember? Did we do that in Erie?
I'll start looking that up to see
Okay.
if we have that. Yeah.
So one of the questions I was typing in a direct message to Charles was that I think it could be really interesting to now take this down to an individual neighborhood level and also show how you could use these scores to shape your approach to revitalizing a particular neighborhood. For instance, one of the things while Pete's looking, I'll ask you to talk about again, Charles, is I've certainly seen you sort of shorthand for different audiences that one of the ways to look at your data is how do we take a block with an average score of 3 and get it to a 2, or take a 2 to a 1 in a neighborhood. That's one way I think of sort of looking overall at a neighborhood and saying, okay, so in this corner of the neighborhood, we have really strong property conditions. We can correlate that with who owns the property, whether it's rental or owner occupied. We can correlate that with housing values, and we can think about what are the needs of that group of blocks versus a group of blocks where it's much more perhaps absentee owned, much more problematic building conditions, and what are the right goals for us to set. It's a different set of goals. I'm guessing in my work it is when you have a group of blocks that are largely rental and have problems than a group of blocks where there may be an average condition and they're owner occupied, right? So can you talk about just how being able to break down the neighborhood into more specific components can help you shape a neighborhood strategy?
Okay, can you give me permission to share a screen? I can try something.
Okay. And does he have the ability?
Yeah, I've got it. Okay, so let's see. I don't know if I can do this quickly on the fly, but I just did this
Oh, yeah.
while you were asking the question, okay?
Sure.
All right, so what we try to do is just use a variety of color codes. And so let's assume, for instance, I don't know, can you see this moving around a little bit?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so let's assume that this is, I'm doing it very quickly and without any planning, so I'm sorry if it's going to be clumsy. Let's assume this is your street, okay? Right here, okay? And let's see. There's your street, okay? So if you've got, I got to get my tools. I'm sorry, guys. So if you've got this street that you're dealing with right here, okay? This is the street you're dealing with, right? You want to be thinking about where do you put your resources, okay? To make it a little bit, because one of the things we've learned is how to think about the numbering system and therefore whatever color coding system. Okay, so let's take a city like let's take a city like Erie, Pennsylvania. All right, if we have a 1910 3-bedroom, 1-bath, wooden 4-square in this condition, this house right here. Okay, for us to get that marketable in a near downtown neighborhood, right? That might cost us $75,000 in catch-up costs, okay? If the ambition is not to get it into marketable condition, but simply to get it into a C of O, it might cost $15,000, right? So what scoring allows us to do is to take, all of the scores that we may have and now look at this whole long street, for instance. And if we've only got $100,000, ask ourselves, or at least we ask the client, would you rather spend, 30,000, it's not New York. We're not dealing with the environmental requirements in New York. We're going to go to Ohio that you could tear down anything for, for nothing and not worry about asbestos. So we take this out and take this out, and we've spent next to nothing, right? Is that smart, right? Or is it smart to leave those and rehab these, for instance, and bring those to that cost, right? And so we will work through dozens of permutations of sort of asking ourselves, if we have fill in the blank amount of money, and let's get rid of this side of the block and get rid of this side of the block. And our client has already said, you're working on this street, tell me what to do, okay? There are an infinite number of permutations on how to work this through. What we've learned, though, is while you're taking this one out, or not taking it out, trying to turn this into that, if you are not expeditious in that, these houses here could have all flipped red in the process, right? And so what we're trying to do is get our clients to think in real time with limited resources, to borrow my friend Michael Braverman's words, a whole block strategy, right? How do we make sure anything we do on this street positively affects all of these properties, right? And so when we think of a property, when I think of a property, these are placeholders right now, everybody. When I think of a property, if this is the property I'm playing with, what I'm doing is I'm asking myself, how does it influence these 9 around it? Okay, because those 9 around it are instantly going to be the beneficiaries of whatever I do with this. Okay, and that is true however we begin to move our money, right? So we're thinking about, does our client have the construction capacity, the spec writing capacity, the acquisition rehab capacity to move quickly? Can they get the property on the market quickly? Do they know, if they're only doing this property, how to work with the residents of all the adjoining properties, right? How do they make it work together? And while you're doing that, pay close attention to the opportunity costs of what's going on these properties, right? Furthermore, if you're dealing with an Akron, a Detroit, a Milwaukee, any of the cities, for instance, that will have 10 times the infrastructure needs that they actually have a budget for, right? How do you begin thinking about the infrastructure of this road, the sidewalks, this tree canopy, the pipes underneath from a planning perspective, while you're dealing with these 9 properties right here in that street, right? So the scoring, really, to Pete's point, it's not about the scoring, it's about all the things that it helps you think about.
Exactly.
That's really what it is.
Agree.
That help, Marcia?
Yeah. And so, we should have another webinar someday about the whole block strategy and just how you think that through and how you think about adjacent blocks and all of that. I often open my neighborhood strategy classes with saying, what motivates me to keep thinking about this is that it was the awareness I came to at some point in my career that having a strategy for neighborhood revitalization is not announcing that certain programs are available in a neighborhood. That's not a strategy. That's just a program announcement. The strategy is, how do you evaluate your different options for investment and opportunities and make sure that you're thinking about those 9 properties that are getting impacted by the one property and the other adjacent blocks. I think that Brooke mentioned that another use for this data could be to, in fact, identify those key problem properties that may not make sense financially. I'm embellishing a little bit, to do on their own. There may be real appraisal gaps, but if you realize the properties around it and how visible it is and how much of an impact a condition of that one property has on the way people perceive the whole neighborhood, or at least those adjacent blocks, it may suddenly make sense to you to actually take that hit on them.
That's exactly. I think Brooke's exactly right. And if I go back to this just for a second, don't underestimate what this, it's camel's nose under the tent. What this lets you do is now you're interacting with residents, right?
Mhm.
Right now you actually are having a conversation about what it means to live on this block, right? To be invested in this block, right? Don't assume each of these are single family detached either. Some of these are duplexes, some of these are threes, if you're in Hartford, if you're in Frog Hollow, some of these are sixes, right? So you're constantly using this as a mechanism to figure out, maybe I've got a mom and pop land owner of one unit in a three. It's across from a very troubled six. Maybe that troubled six is the key to unlocking this, right? And so it's cracking open your capacity to think strategically end to end on a block about the problem you're trying to solve. Is it black wealth, white wealth gap? Is it negative equity? Is it post rehab negative equity? Is it a marketing issue? You know, and all of those are questions that deserve a lot of time and thinking. This becomes one more data set that helps you be, I think, somewhat imaginative in how to serve the residents there, right? And get that block into a condition where it performs.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't know if she's still here, but I think Pilar Hogan was in this call for a while. And I know that they've done an extraordinary amount of acquisition, rehab, resale in East Camden. And they're one of the rare organizations I know of who, when they do one of those big investment properties on a block, they also go around to all the other houses on that block and ask, try to figure out, does anybody need a rehab loan? Can we do a block improvement project? So just like you were pointing out, Charles, is that it's not just that property you think about, it's how do we work with all the residents around that property to leverage the investment we're making and to take advantage of this to really transform this block. So I wanted to acknowledge her work there. I also wanted to, you told me a story recently, Charles, about what it's like to work with neighborhood residents in doing this scoring and how you are able to collect, not only do they have a different sort of lens to look at their neighborhood, but they're also able to feed in yet another level of data while they're doing the scoring for you, or in addition to, interpreting the scoring about what are maybe some of the causes behind what you're seeing in the property scoring. Does that sound familiar to you? Like they know when Mrs. Smith, that's Mrs. Smith's house, she can't get out to, and if you find out there's 3 Mrs. Smiths on a block, then you can start thinking about, oh, we need a Mrs. Smith strategy.
That's right. It's the qualitative data is invaluable. And so I suppose there's a number of things to quickly touch on. One is you have an opportunity to mobilize residents to become a bit more self-aware about what's going on, right? Second is I have found, this is an anecdote, but it's repeated enough, when residents score, right, they are actually far better scores than students. Students want to give everybody a pass, right? Residents are like, no effing way am I giving Henry a pass on this house, right? And they're clear, right? Henry's a slob, so they score him as such, right? And so you get a pretty good accurate reading, but you also get an opportunity to have the conversation that leads to, how does this condition relate to chaos, disorder, disinvestment? How does this condition relate to the opposite? How does it relate to confidence? How does it relate to people staying inside and fear coming out, right? What does it tell us about a street of elderly residents who, but for, right, would be operating at a different level? And then, well, that's the gap to address, right? For some folks, it's money. For other folks, they can't get on a ladder, right? As my old friend and colleague, David Belke, would say, but everybody can bake cookies, okay? And so when you're trying to influence the degree to which residents are involved on their street, and we're working on 1 or 2 or 3 houses, somebody around there can bake a lemon cake, right? Somebody can participate in some way in that conversation, right? And so that's very valuable. Another point, though, we had a tricky situation in Chattanooga some years ago, which is, it's a complicated city to score because of its topography and weather, right? The settlement patterns are tricky, but it is like many cities, very segregated, right? And we had a young group of young scorers out there who we were paying through a very high performing nonprofit in Chattanooga. And we had to be really careful about their safety scoring. And so if you're going to do something like that, we had to pick up, you talk to the fire department, you talk to the police department, you let them know, look, our scorers are going to be in these neighborhoods. These are their names. You are mindful that some blocks are dangerous because of drugs. Some blocks are dangerous because the people in there don't know who's doing the scoring, right? So be mindful of things like that.
Yeah, another reason why, if you can have actual neighborhood residents participating in the scoring, it can be really, really helpful. I wanted to acknowledge there's been a couple of questions in here that have to do with, the weather thing. You want to address the weather thing, Charles?
Pete, I mean, we do pay attention to it. Pete, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, usually the summers, summers are usually the best time to do this survey. We try not to do these surveys like over the winter, especially in cold climates where snow can obscure some things about a house, and it's also uncomfortable to do this surveying work in. So I would say, you try to avoid times of the year in certain climates where the weather can make it difficult to see a house and really get an accurate assessment. In the same way that we don't want people doing this work at 1:30 in the morning, doing it after 2 feet of snow have fallen in upstate New York is not, not conducive to being accurate. So, usually what's nice for the surveyors, whether they're volunteers or students, is that this is for them to do, that they can sort of manage their time and, see what times work for them. When will they feel most comfortable being out? Do they want to bring a partner with them? Sometimes this is done, people do this mostly on their own. Sometimes people are trained as partners depending on the nature of the situation. So we leave a lot up to the surveyors to decide, in terms of time, the dates and times they do it, how they do it. We find that often is very helpful to recruit surveyors and for them to feel empowered to sort of make the decisions that we're asking them to make once they're out there.
Pete, Charles was telling me that you're actually in a situation in many places where you're able to pay often resident scorers every day, like by Venmo instantly. Like you can see their scores populating the live mapping system that you have, and you just Venmo them. Is that it?
Yeah. We've, in addition to switching over to an app to do the scoring, we've also, depending on the situation of the surveyor, they can wait till the end of the project and get a lump sum check, or we can give them kind of, payments throughout the way, so that they can cover gas if they're doing mostly driving, cover other expenses. I will note that during the pandemic, it has become a growing challenge to find, in the same way that it's difficult to find workers for other things. It's been harder to find recruits to do this survey work when we've had to hire students or non-resident volunteers, and so we've had to actually up what we're paying to try to be more competitive. So that's something that we suspect, if others on this webinar will have done this or are planning to do this, it's a challenge you'll run into. And that's why having a volunteer base, a resident base, is actually a very, very good way to go. You don't have to worry about sending out job posters and, hiring people is, the rigmarole of that, is its own administrative task. So, but yeah, the pandemic has made it a bigger challenge to find.
But I do
resources.
really love it as a very direct and fast way to get resources into the hands of neighborhood residents while they are, doing a job that they're probably especially good at because they know the place and is probably increasing their capacity. I mean, there's all kinds of great things about that. And I love that you're able to pay them so instantly that way. There's one more question.
Marcia, we had a young lady in two scores in Troy, New York. And it was the first time I could watch the scoring online. So you could just see the dots like on the map. The map was changing color in real time. And every day she would just, by agreement, she would text me and say, I did 300, can I get paid? And so we were able to just use PayPal and make sure that the user charges were to us, not to her. She got 100% of the commission right there, right away, every day, and it was invaluable. We got great scores, and she got paid right away. It was really good.
Yeah, I just find that really fascinating. There was one more question here that has to do with, another one of the wrinkles that we're all experiencing because of the pandemic, like the tremendous rise in construction costs. And I'm not sure exactly what this means. Does this increase the value of standing homes in your estimation, even if they score a 5? Will it cause you to pause prior to demo, knowing that the cost to frame build anything new could be a high barrier to replacement?
I have to really think about that. So probably yes, it would absolutely make us rethink the demolition because the cost benefit would be different, right? So my inclination would be that's probably a scarce land market, and demand is significant, where that would be acutely the case. But my inclination is absolutely you'd want to be rethinking the conclusions on the demo candidate for sure. You might still give it a 5. Whether or not you demo it is something else.
A different, yeah. And I think like with all data, what it mostly gives you the opportunity to do is to have a more informed conversation with everybody involved, right? To say, okay, we know this data, what else do we know that's out there and that we should be taking into consideration as we make a decision about how best to use our scarce resources, how best to roll out a strategy in terms of what comes first, how best to do, accompanying strategies around one big project. There's all that stuff. So it's always a conversation starter. And I think it just gives us a better set of information to start with. And also to evaluate change over time, I think. So we're about to run out of time. I'm so grateful to both Charles and Pete for sharing this with us. I mean, this is really, I feel really lucky, like we got to see behind the curtain here in a good way, because this is, something they do all the time. And I think it's something that we could, each of us, replicate in the way that it works best for us in our communities to help get a handle on what are building conditions in a way that doesn't take us 6 months to collect, and therefore that we could repeat every few years so we could check progress on not just individual properties, but average block scores, to see, is the strategy we cooked up the first time we did this, is it actually panning out in terms of making some impact on the scores of properties? And if it's not, why not? And how might we adjust? So I hope that everybody gives us some more thought, and please stay in touch with me if you take this to the next step, what your thoughts are, what your experiences are. I think we should keep up this conversation over the coming years about how best to assess building conditions and how to use that data. So we always like to promote the Center for Community Progress, who also offers some great webinars. They call it their Cornerstone webinar series, and we cross promote with each other the webinars that we do. Our next webinar is November 16th, and this is a hot topic now. The title is Shut Out, Exploring the Impact of Institutional Investors on Middle Neighborhoods. It's becoming, I mean, it's always been a problem. I feel like it's anecdotally, people are telling me it's getting much worse during the pandemic. Maybe because of the pandemic, maybe it's just, coincidental, set of factors that are coming together. We certainly, our speakers are from the Cleveland metro area. They've had a lot of experience in tracking, in figuring out how to understand what's happening in a real-time basis, and who the investors are, and what their motivations are, and what are different carrot and stick strategies to use to address it. So it may have some real practical information for everyone who attends. Thank you again, Charles and Pete. I really love this webinar, and we'll see you out in the field somewhere.
Thank you. Thank you.
For more information, middleneighborhoods.org. See you guys next month. Bye-bye.